I'm a professor of gender and violence and international policy at the University of Bristol, and I've been doing research on all sorts of violence against women and children, and work on perpetrators, sexual violence, domestic violence, forced marriage, etc. for many years. And very interested in issues around gendering of domestic abuse, because I still think it's an issue we really need to talk about quite a lot. And we still see, it's a really important factor in terms of services and so on. So what I'm going to talk about is just some of the background data we have on this, but I also want to talk, I was asked by Siobhan if I'd just talk about a project we've done recently that was also led by Women's Aid, but sort of a joint project we've had, which was also looking at gendering and misogyny in domestic abuse cases, because it really shows up kind of how the processes around gendering also work. So I'll talk a bit, and then, but if you've got questions, just jump in, and I'll take questions at the end as well, so we can have a bit of a debate. But just the parameters, which you probably will know about anyway, but that's definitely the patterns we see. Women are more likely to be victims of domestic abuse, and that's in the UK, but also internationally. And part of that is also repeat victimization. So often in the prevalence data, we come up with, like in the English Wales data, like so many other places, if you just look at headline prevalence, you get something like 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men experiencing some sort of domestic abuse in the last year or so, or in the last ever or so. But once you start looking in detail at what's going on underneath, of course, those quite close figures start to really disaggregate a lot. And one of the reasons is that the type of things that are experienced by men and women are actually, and that they're recording on a lot of these surveys, is quite different. So repeat victimization is one of the things that's really different. Women end up experiencing that pattern of domestic abuse over time and longer term. What men are reporting may just be a one-off thing, or less likely to be so repeated over time. Women also much more likely to be seriously harmed or killed. I mean, domestic abuse murders, much higher where women are concerned. So we're beginning to see that kind of similar sort of figure of experiencing something or other, as I say, really disaggregating in terms of the number of events over time and the seriousness of those events over time as well, the harm that they actually cause to women much more than men. And then also there seems to be a differentiation in terms of levels of fear, that the type of fear that women experience is quite different. It's, the violence that women, and I'm talking here about almost exclusively violence from men to women, and women experiencing that really scary domestic abuse, and that's what's inducing levels of fear. And also when you start then looking at, I know that in Ireland you've been discussing having legislation on coercive control, and we've got that in the UK. And the coercive controlling behaviours, of course, are those really often difficult things to see, but all the variety of behaviours that perpetrators will use to make sure that the victims do what they want and continue to control them. And that's also bound in with much higher levels of fear. That type of abuse, again, women much more likely to experience what we might see as coercive controlling behaviours. So what we end up with, it really, from the various evidence, is that there are differences in abuse experiences by gender, by sex, and that also reflects the unfortunate patterns that we still have within our societies of the structural inequalities against women. And women may face multiple inequalities. And of course, it's also reflected in something like the Istanbul Convention, which talks about how, and also the UN frameworks on violence against women, which talks about gendered inequalities leading to violence against women, disproportionate amount of violence against women of a gendered nature, but also how it recreates those gendered inequalities as well. And if you look at something like, how does, again, domestic abuse work? It's quite different if men or women are perpetrators as well, because of course women will also use violence against men or against other women, or men will use violence against women and against other men. But it is these different patterns. So for women from men, we see, as I was just saying, more fear, control, mix of coercion, physical, sexual, and financial abuse. Whereas men, when they talk about what they experience, they're much more likely to talk about abuse as a form of emasculation. It seems to be much more about dents to their masculinity, to their sense of entitlement, than scary, fearful kind of advance and abuse. And that also means that you actually get men talking about being able to manage the violence from women in a way that women can't manage the violence from men. So, for example, in some of the interviews we've done over the years, men talking about how, they were able to grab the woman and take the knife off her, whereas when the women, they weren't able to do that with the men, and they just tried to get the hell out. So really different experiences and responses. And also men from other men. Now that's similar to what women experience from men. So it is about male violence against women and against men. So fear, control, but also difficult to see what's going on as domestic abuse. Also experience sexual violence. And one of the things that comes up quite a bit with men on men domestic abuse is control of spending. But of course, we also see economic abuse and financial abuse in heterosexual relationships too. But this also maps back onto the Johnson typology, which you may have quite likely come across. So he talks about coercive controlling violence, or what he's also called intimate terrorism. And he talks about violent resistance and situational violence. But of course, what we see from the evidence in terms of what mainly women experience from men is also that coercive controlling violence, that intimate terrorism that Johnson outlines, with men as the primary aggressor, even if women are using violence in the relationship too, primary aggressor being the man, and more likely to cause fear and be coercive controlling. Whereas with violent resistance, that's where we see women's violence against men that's seemingly at a high level of violence, but because women ending up using weapons, but in resistance. And we often see that in police databases, that women end up with very high levels of arrest or offences, but because they're using weapons, but not necessarily as a primary aggressor, but as a way of protecting themselves and their children. But then it's the woman who ends up being seen as the perpetrator. And that's really problematic. And then you get situational violence, which is much sort of more ongoing, sort of low level, once-off situations, possibly in both directions of the couple, but also can be in contexts where there's a lot of chaos, and some of the alcohol and drugs misuse where there's not a primary aggressor, but where they're kind of, it's part of an ongoing really chaotic situation. So these are quite different scenarios, then they also therefore need to be thought about in different ways. So I always sort of wonder, what about who you're working with? What's the shape of what you're working with? Are you working with intimate terrorism, violent resistance, and/or situational couple violence? So unless you've got anything specific to ask about that, I want to move on now to look at some of this work that we've been doing with Women's Aid on looking in more detailed at the gendering, the narratives, the discourses around gendering that comes up in domestic abuse, in experiences of victims and survivors, and also in the discourses from professionals who work with survivors. And you can look up the whole report. I personally think, a fascinating report, so do go off and look for it on the Women's Aid website. And this work, it actually, we looked in this particular piece of work at 36 transcripts of interviews with survivors. But it came from a set of interviews from our Justice Project, where we'd done 251 interviews with survivors of all forms of gender-based violence. And we'd also done a considerable number of interviews with professionals. And we'd also tracked cases through police databases, over 1,400 cases. So this work comes from that wider project. But what we took for this one was to look at in a real detail at these 36 interview transcripts. Now, I'm just going to close my curtain a little bit so that I can actually see. That's better. That's better. And the 36 transcripts that we chose for this study was really because we wanted they're all domestic abuse experiences, but they're also a real range of survivors in terms of social class, ethnicity, age, and disability experiences. So we made sure that we actually had the reflection of a whole set of different intersectional kind of issues as well. And then what we used is what's called critical discourse analysis, which is really looking at sort of both what's there and what isn't there, if you like, but in terms of what people are, the kind of ideas people are using and drawing on. And the things I want to talk about here are sort of three of the main themes that we came up with, which is the way that household and relationship roles are talked about, and then some of the issues in terms of sexuality and links with intimate partner relationships. And also mental health actually came up as a very important issue in these discourses as well. So in terms of household roles, what came through were things like women saying, they were told that they had to strive to make sure the relationship was working. And the onus was on her. This thing that she was being told either by family, by friends, by professionals, that she was the one responsible, really. That's what this indicates. So she had to strive to make sure the relationship was working, rather than them being told, well, he has to stop being abusive and violent. And we need to think about how we're talking about these things and what it is that we are actually implying when we use these different forms of these different terms and these different language approaches. They're told, don't call the police because he had a good job. So this guy was, middle class, professional, don't rock the boat in terms of his profession, his job. That instead of that he has put his own job at risk by behaving abusively. she's told, what did you do to upset him? Instead of, why has he chosen to be abusive? And we keep seeing in these ways that the women are being talked to, that the onus, as I said, is on her. It's not saying, actually, he is the one responsible for what he's done. So if we look at that in terms of these household roles and the household discourses, we have at the center of that the woman is seen as the homemaker and the man as the head of household, which seems very traditional, doesn't it? But that's actually still what really comes through when you start looking at what women are told. And so she says, you know, it's my job to run the household and his to basically tell me what to do. So you get this, you really get the man as the decision maker. And he also micromanages the household tasks by not making decisions in household tasks, but kind of in a wider sense telling her what to do. And it's something that Catherine Doddeman and I also found when we were looking at LGBT, or especially LGBT relationships, that these rules in relationships are really important to situate somebody as either an abuser or the victim. And this who takes on the dominant decision maker role, it's a gendered kind of perspective, but can also, in a same-sex relationship, be placed on one of the two partners as well. So you got here the female homemaker, you know, not a role that she's taken, or that she's wanted necessarily, but she ends up tasked with household chores and childcare. But you know, she's not the one who is ultimately making the decisions about how this is to be performed. He is performance managing her and saying if she's not doing things right. And that all the time is being underpinned and reinforced by threats of violence and abuse. So she says, I'd be called to account if things weren't done. Just to be subservient and just to do everything that he said, or not to have a voice or opinion. That's how I'm supposed to be. Another one, I kind of thought it was normal at the time. You know, a man tells you what to do and you do whatever he says. And then you've got the sexual violence aspect, or the sexualization of sexuality, the constructs of sexuality in these relationships as well. And of course, we see that in a very obvious way within things like pornography, where women are objectified, women are objects. But the sexual objectification of women also very much going on through these relationships. And we see it in the discourses that the women talk about. So, and women, one of the themes that you get through from that is how women are sexual objects to be used by the men in their sexual gratification. It's not about what women necessarily want in terms of fulfilling their sexual needs. And again, the onus is to be sexually available to the male partner, not the other way around. And also feeds into all the narratives about sexual jealousy and women as sexual objects to be jealously guarded as belonging exclusively to their male partners, not to be looked at, not to be commented on, not for anybody else to flirt with. You know, she gets it in the neck, so to speak. She's the one who gets told off if she's seen as sexualized by any other man as well. And also rape and sexual abuse then as routine, as part of the domestic abuse. That she has to be available in these different ways, but also that it's used both to put her in her place, but also to show that, you know, she has to be there for him. and within again a wider context of sexual objectification. So again, the different women in the transcripts talking about, you would tell me that when you're in a relationship, basically you have sex, even the other person doesn't really want to. Sorry, these have got a bit mixed up, haven't they, in my slide there, but like, he'd force things like oral sex and contact and stuff like that, and then rape me quite regularly, but not sort of in a violent way, more of a coercive way. And then this one, if I can't really move that one, sorry. And then we've got the mental health discourse as well, where what we see centrally here is this idea that actually the women are crazy. The men keep talking in ways that situate the women as being crazy, that she's mentally ill, and therefore she's the problem, not him and his abuse. It's her who's crazy, and that she's making it up. So, you know, it's also kind of into the sort of gaslighting territory. So giving her that label of mental illness, which has all sorts of implications for the women, because it may be that the professionals actually at times believe that, or he manages to get her sectioned, and I mean all sorts of possible consequences for her, also in terms of her relationship with children or links to children, etc. As I say, she's the one who is labelled as problematic instead of him. And also that this shows very little understanding by others of the actual mental health impacts of the abuse that she's experiencing. And that, of course, she may have mental health consequences from the abuse, but that's not because she is the crazy woman, but because of what he's doing to her. And that's what we really need to think about. So the women end up being painted as emotional, unstable, crazy, and not to be taken seriously. You shouldn't listen to her. In the end, we end up listening to the abuser. And therefore he can use it as a tool for abuse. So again, some of the things that the different women said in the interviews, you know, they're painting me as this crazy woman. And it's no wonder that your children are messed up with a mother like you who's so mentally crazy. That's what she's being told, that she's the crazy mother and that she's impacting her children in that way. Or he's tainted them against me and told them I'm a complete and utter lunatic and a maniac and a twit. And also in the courts, especially the family courts, where, as this woman says, the courts are extremely sexist places. There's still very much a thing about an angry, loud woman is crazy. So if she's trying to sort of say what's really happened and the frustration of her ending up talking with a loud voice, actually she's very quickly placed in a position of being crazy. And on the other hand, the abusive men are charming with professionals. So we see how these different things end up situating the woman as she is this crazy woman and situating her as the real problem. And this quote, I think, is so important. It really exemplifies so much about what the women were then saying, that we really need to turn around this whole way in which people keep ending up labeling women, making women responsible, you know, allowing men to use sexual violence in relationships. And this woman talks about her resistance. So she's saying, what describes me is being bullied to death, you know, and reacting to being bullied. So she is trying to say what's happening to her. But what label is that? You know, so I've had mental health issues as regards to being depressed because of the situation. But that situation is oppression. It's not because I am crazy, is really what she's trying to say. And she says, I call it oppression, not depression. I have a different description. So let's end up in this place where we say, yes, what it's about oppression of women. It's not depression, but it's depression that has been placed on women by abusive men. And if you want to read the whole report, it's there on the Women's Aid website. So I shall finish there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marianne. That's really interesting. And I think you really got to the nub of it in such short notice as well. And it really is, I suppose, the positioning of women in society, and then the family home being a microcosm, I suppose, of that. I'm conscious that you're rushing away. You have other
but I can take some questions. I think we're just horrified at this. What we always think of. Oh, it's kind of this sounds such old hat, or it sounds so traditional, but it's there. It's now. We're in 2021, 22. When we're looking at these things, and
the microcosm of the home is.
Yeah, and it goes across women from different, from really different contexts as well.
Yeah. Has anybody got any queries or questions? You can unmute for them, or if you want to put something through chat, I'm happy to read it out if people don't want to.
Hi, Claire. I mean, Siobhan, isn't it your name?
It is, I know. How are you doing?
Your name here is Claire, but anyway.
Yeah, you're saying yes, that's what they always say. It's like,
Thank you, Marianne, for that. And I'm just wondering, because we have all this like narrative, is it like a possibility to, I mean, the people who's working with domestic violence women, and even in court, is it possible to use this narrative in, like, say, oh, this is a crazy woman, that stands out the most because we are having the same thing. They are treating the woman as crazy, but the woman seems to be like, because of the things that are happening to her, that's what makes her depressed and been sent to the hospital and been called crazy. In fairness, if we have this into like the doctors or the psychologists that have this narrative, maybe it's like an alarm or red flag for them. Say, okay, this is not just a mental health issue, and we need to further investigate. This might relate to a domestic violence, because if we have this red flag, it will save the woman in the future. Yeah, because it looks like it's too late sometimes, and they end up dying already. So
I think what you're saying is so important, Amal. You're about Amal. I don't know what.
Noor is my name. Sorry.
Noor, yeah, sorry, Noor. Yeah, I think what you're saying is really, really important. And actually, Women's Aid ended up writing a whole report on the mental health issues. Which is very, very good, and they've been using it in training in the UK, and that also very much draws on this work as well as from some of the other work they have from their own helplines and so on as well. So, and I think you're absolutely right. This is a red flag. If they start talking about mental health issues and crazy woman, they've got to ask what's going on behind that. What's going on in your relationship? You have to look at that. But the other part of that, actually, we did a very big study of men in GP surgeries, in doctor surgeries, where we surveyed 1,300 men attending doctor surgeries. And we actually found that men who said they had anxiety or depression were 5 to 6 times more likely to be perpetrators of domestic abuse than if they weren't talking about having anxiety and depression. So actually the red flag goes both ways, that you've got to ask what a guy's up to. If they're also saying, oh, I'm sad, and of course they don't talk about necessarily being depressed, they talk about being sad. So men talk about being sad and women are talked about as being mad, is that sort of kind of division. But we need to ask, get the medics really looking at that both ways.
Okay, thank you. We just have
Yeah.
a comment as well there, just to say thank you. It's very informative, especially the oppression and depression piece.
Yeah, so I think you put that up on your wall.
Yeah, and the mad and sad. I mean, that's really interesting
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Any other questions for Marianne before she has to leave us, or comment on her piece, which was really interesting?
It will be interesting to know about the men, because men rarely say anything about their feelings. That's very difficult to know whether they've been domestic abused, but that finding is another red flag, I would say,
Yeah.
for the men one. But to be honest, we are dealing more of the woman, because the women are more the fear is much more bigger than the male one. So yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, Siobhan, I would just say that I was looking at two pieces of research. One was the Australian Institute of Criminology, and the other was the Home Office in the UK. And both of them at the end came up with that it was perceived violation of gender norms and the challenging the offender's masculinity. And in that, another piece of research was saying that coercive control, that micromanagement was the golden thread running through domestic abuse and homicides. And I think that's your presentation there really encapsulates that. And it's really interesting. I was looking at a case study last night, and you might be familiar with Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie in the US, where there's a body cam of the hour that the police spent with two of them after they were pulled in, after a witness had seen him slap her. And she ended up being deemed the primary aggressor. And her partner, Brian Laundrie, actually called her a bit of a crazy woman. And then the whole conversation became about one of the police officers. His wife had been similar, and she took some medication and she was much better now, his ex-wife. So this is the common thread: coercive control and fixed gender roles and challenging the masculinity.
Yeah, thank you, Madeleine, for saying about that as well. It also makes me, there's one particular example that I was sort of think back to as well in terms of the men, which is one of the men that we interviewed. He's who said he'd experienced domestic abuse, ongoing domestic abuse, but for him, what that consisted of was that his wife, he'd married a much younger woman. And really, he wanted to spend the weekends with his mates, his male mates, going down to the pub. But she wanted him to spend time at the weekend going to a garden centre to get plants and to look at ways of doing their garden. And that was what he said was abusive, because he found it so shameful and so awful to have to tell his mates he couldn't go down the pub because he was going to a garden centre, that was so emasculating, that was abusive. And you think, no. That's something really, really different kind of. That's not domestic abuse. To have to go to a garden centre, you have to work out what then work out what you want to do. But that's not the kind of the real.
Yeah, the perceived.
Yeah. And it fits back into what you were saying about that emasculation as well.
Yeah, and that
we've got to be so careful that we end up with seeing dense to male entitlement as being abuse, and that's why the men who are the perpetrators end up seeing themselves as the victims.
Yeah. And the Home Office in the UK, one of their recommendations was funding for training on attitudes, and you're saying it's like we're going back 50 years. It's like,
yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we still haven't nailed it, and it is that that you're picking up on the micromanagement. And I think so often we end up standing too far back and looking at sort of wider patterns, but we really need to look at this micro stuff and what's going on to see how it works.
Yeah.
Anyway, I shall have to go, but
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great to
and
have you.
do go off and look at the report.
Absolutely.
On the Women's Aid website, and I hope you can all use it in training. Yeah.